We have breaking news right now. Terrible news overnight. Breaking news right now. Breaking news right now. We have breaking news right now coming out of Toronto. There has been yet another plane crash. A Bering Air flight in Alaska has officially gone missing. Another terrible plane crash in America. A fighter jet. A plane crash has occurred in Marana, Arizona.
If your TikTok For You page was anything like mine, late January to mid-February, you were seeing plane crashes left, right, and center. Most recently with the in-air collision between American Airlines Flight 5342 and the Black Hawk military helicopter on January 29th, and the medical plane crash in Philadelphia a few days after that. Obviously, the perception that plane crashes are becoming increasingly frequent is very jarring and scary, but are crashes actually becoming more frequent? Statistics say no. In fact, Jim Brockle told Newsweek that, quote, there is on average a plane crash somewhere in the US every other day, with 99% of crashes involving non-commercial planes. The last fatal crash of a commercial plane in the US of a similar magnitude to Flight 5342 was in 2009 in New York.
In fact, according to numbers from the National Transportation Safety Board, January and February were actually much safer than usual. On average, based on numbers from 2014 to 2024, there are about 20 fatal aviation accidents in each of those months per year. However, in 2025, January only had 10 and February only had 6.
Even then, while everyone knows that flying is statistically the safest mode of travel, our perception of risk isn't solely based on statistics, and there's a limit to the amount of comfort that numbers can bring. So why does it feel like crashes are more frequent? This is the main question we'll be answering in this video. We'll break down the psychology behind this fear, how cognitive biases shape our perception, and how social media fuels the panic. We'll also examine how political discourse distorts these tragedies, most recently through Trump's scapegoating of DEI processes. Finally, we'll have a meta discussion on why people struggle to accept uncertainty, why we don't know yet is the hardest answer for the internet to handle.
I've got to get out of here! Calm down, get a hold of yourself!
Our brains are hardwired to evaluate threats because for most of human history, recognizing danger was a matter of life and death. Our ancestors who overestimated threats, like assuming rustling in the bushes was a predator, were more likely to survive. Those who ignored them, not so much. Even though modern fears are vastly different, our brains haven't fully caught up. This is why sometimes we fear things that are statistically safe, like plane crashes, even when the actual risk is incredibly low. But if our brains are just trying to protect us, why do these fears feel so disproportionate? To answer why and how we misjudge risk, we need to look at how our minds process information and the cognitive shortcuts that shape our perception of threats.
In Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking, Fast and Slow, he proposes his dual process theory, System 1 and System 2.
Kahneman describes System 1 as a kind of thinking that's fast, automatic, and intuitive, operating with little to no effort. This type of thinking is unconscious and allows us to make snap judgments and decisions based on patterns and past experiences. When a driver sees a red brake light ahead, they instinctively hit their brakes. This rapid automatic response has been conditioned through repeated experience and occurs without conscious thought. Conversely, System 2 is slow and deliberate, requiring conscious and intentional effort to use. This system is used for active and complex problem solving where deeper thinking and consideration are needed. When making a new recipe or driving in an unfamiliar country, you have to consciously think about each step since you can't rely on past experiences to get you through. Think of them as two halves of the same cognitive system that represent two distinct modes of thinking within the human brain. So how does this relate to cognitive biases? Well, decision-making and information synthesis are both cognitively demanding tasks, or tasks that use a lot of mental energy. Kahneman uses the example of driving in his book. When on familiar routes like driving to work or driving home, the route is familiar or second nature. Once you've driven these routes hundreds of times, you stop actively thinking about each turn and go off of instinct. This is System 1 thinking. In the same way you're not thinking about the route, our brains have adapted and created shortcuts called heuristics to minimize the amount of mental energy used in daily tasks and decision making. Saving mental energy is a good thing, as it allows us to conserve it for instances that require deeper thinking and problem solving. If we didn't use heuristics, every automatic decision, judgment, or behavior would demand slow, deliberate thought, making even the simplest tasks mentally exhausting. When you see a red light, you don't consciously think, I should stop because red means stop. You automatically hit the brakes. Imagine having to deliberate whether or not to brake or overthink which cereal to buy at the store. It would be paralyzing. Without heuristics, we'd struggle to function in daily life, but they aren't perfect by any means. These mental shortcuts can also lead us to make mistakes. While quick decisions use cues from the environment and past experiences to determine the best course of action, they don't always consider all the information. For example, imagine you're walking alone at night and see someone wearing a hoodie with their hands in their pockets. Your instinct might tell you they're suspicious or dangerous. It's better to assume a threat and be wrong than ignore one and be right. But in your rush to judge, you didn't notice the sweat on their hoodie or their running shoes or the gym bag slung over their shoulder. In reality, they're just walking home after a workout. Because System 1 prioritizes speed over accuracy, it relies on mental shortcuts known as heuristics to make snap judgments. However, these shortcuts don't always lead to right conclusions. In many cases, they contribute to cognitive biases that shape how we perceive events and make decisions. 3 key biases drive this distortion: the availability heuristic, which makes recent events feel more common; the frequency illusion, which makes us hyper aware of certain patterns; and the negativity bias, which makes us fixate on the worst possible outcomes. The availability heuristic is defined as the tendency to use information that comes to mind quickly and easily when assessing risks or making decisions about the future. With the recent crashes dominating the news, our minds have been flooded with footage, headlines, and theories surrounding the tragedy. Because this information is so immediate and vivid, it can create the illusion that plane crashes are becoming more frequent, even when the data says otherwise. Not only do recent tragedies feel more frequent, but they also stick in our minds because of their emotional weight. To honor those we lost, these tragedies often become intertwined with emotionally charged stories as we watch parents, children, friends, and family members start to process their grief in real time.
Our friends Eddie, Corey, Olivia, and Brielle were on the flight.
What do you think they would think about today?
I think they would be just totally elated that there were all these people here for them who they looked up to and tried to be all these years.
It's long been studied that emotionally charged experiences are easier to remember than neutral ones. From a neuroscience perspective, emotional experiences trigger the release of hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline in particular enhances memory consolidation by activating the amygdala, which helps process emotional significance. The amygdala then strengthens its communication with the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory formation, making emotionally intense events far more memorable than routine experiences. The frequency illusion is a cognitive bias that occurs when something you've recently noticed or learned suddenly seems to appear everywhere. For example, as a Canadian, I'm no stranger to freezing winters, but after moving to a city known for its brutal cold and seeing people bundled up like crazy on the daily, I realized I was lacking in the winter gear department. One day after braving the cold scarfless, I started researching different types of scarves and came across the Acne Studio one. You know, the $300 to $500 checkered ones. While they do look cool, the price tag is abhorrent, so I won't be buying one, but ever since then, I see at least one version of that scarf every time I go outside. Once our brains latch on to particular ideas, patterns, or events, we unconsciously start paying more attention to it, reinforcing the idea that it's becoming more frequent, even when it's not. With plane crashes dominating the news cycle, our minds are now primed to notice every mention of aviation incidents, even minor ones that wouldn't normally catch our attention. A small emergency landing, maybe, a video of turbulence, or even an old story resurfacing online might now feel like further proof that crashes are increasing. In reality, these incidents were always occurring at roughly the same rate. It's just that we're suddenly hyper aware of them in the wake of a big aviation tragedy. The negativity bias is the psychological tendency for negative events to have a stronger impact on our thoughts, emotions, and memory than positive ones. Our brains are wired to prioritize threats over neutral or positive information because, again, from an evolutionary perspective, noticing danger was crucial for survival. This is why one piece of bad news can overshadow a dozen good ones. It's simply how our minds process information. When it comes to plane crashes, this bias plays a huge role in shaping public perception. Thousands of safe flights take off and land every day, but these obviously don't make the news. A tragic crash, however, dominates headlines, trends on social media, and sparks widespread fear. Even if statistics show that flying is still the safest mode of transportation, our brains latch onto the rare but catastrophic failures rather than the routine successes. This is why, despite the data, some people remain terrified of flying. The one horror story outweighs thousands of uneventful flights.
We should suggest you follow Flat Earth Football Club. Don't show him any more sports updates. He doesn't engage.
In an era dominated by social media, cognitive biases are amplified more than ever. These platforms don't just reflect public discourse, they actively shape what we perceive as important and true. Algorithms prioritize engagement, and nothing drives engagement quite like sensationalism and fear. As a result, social media makes rare events feel increasingly common, reinforces fear-driven narratives, and creates the illusion that the world is spiraling out of control. As media sociologist Dr. Peter Vasterman observed, disasters cannot be studied without focusing on the role of mass media, a statement that feels even more relevant in today's hyper-connected world. I've mentioned it a few times already, but what exactly is sensationalism? The Cambridge Dictionary defines it as the act by newspapers, television, etc. of presenting information in a way that is shocking or exciting. Now, this is a solid definition, but in today's attention economy, the goal isn't just to inform, it's to capture and hold your attention as well. Traditional media companies and social media platforms thrive on engagement, and the more attention they generate, the more they profit. These companies are constantly vying for our attention. And while every consumer's preferences and algorithms differ, one thing remains universal: tragedy captivates us. Historical data supports this. In 2014, Vice's Mark Hay reported that CNN's primetime viewership spiked by 68% during the coverage of the missing Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. The same tragedy also drove the highest traffic for BBC since their coverage of the 2011 Japanese tsunami. Of course, this isn't surprising. A spike in viewership is an irresistible incentive for media companies, which at their core are businesses with quotas to meet. To draw readers in, they often resort to sensationalized headlines. Take the Daily Mail, for example. Instead of the straightforward "man reveals last words with wife on AA flight 5342, they opted for "man reveals chilling last words with wife on doomed AA flight 5342 as passengers are pulled from the river." This article follows the grieving husband of one of the victims who, in a state of shock and denial, physically shows reporters his last text from his wife. The article describes the message as chilling, but when the camera zooms in, it reveals an ETA text.
She texted me that they were landing in 20 minutes.
Can you show us a text message that you got from her?
20 minutes. The rest of my text did not get delivered.
Hi, I'm editing, but I'm just watching this video back, and you cannot tell me that those reporters gave a shit about this poor guy. This guy just lost his wife. He's clearly in a state of shock, and his voice is trembling and stuttering. His hands are shaking. And as soon as he mentions that his wife had texted him, the reporters immediately asked him to show his phone. Like he's not already in a completely like delirious state of shock. Of course he's going to show them regardless of if he wants to or not. It just leaves a sour taste in the mouth for sure. Anyways, those are my thoughts.
Ryan Vanacore, writing for the Rochester Institute of Technology, notes one of the biggest uses of sensationalism is headlines. Media outlets know that headlines attract readers, so they use this to their advantage. With the right wording, the most mundane thing can be blown out of proportion. While a plane crash is far from mundane, an ETA text certainly is. But by framing the text this way, the media attempts to tap into consumers' morbid curiosity by building intrigue, making people wonder, what did she say to her husband before the crash? While traditional news outlets sensationalize to capture attention, social media takes it a step further by actively reinforcing our biases through personalized algorithms. These algorithms play a crucial role in amplifying the perceived rise in plane crashes. When algorithms feed us more content, they exploit our cognitive biases. In essence, social media doesn't just reflect our fears, it magnifies and sustains them. The more we engage with tragic events, the more they seem to occur, feeding our fears and distorting our perception of reality. This system thrives on our attention, making our emotions a commodity for profit. But this cycle doesn't stop with fear. The very same incentives that drive sensationalism also give rise to the politicization of tragedy. As events are amplified and framed in increasingly polarizing ways, people can leverage tragedy to push political narratives and further ideological divides.
You're about to lose the midterms, so now it's to your advantage to act on the comment. Right.
As populist messaging, minority scapegoating, and fear-mongering run rampant in today's politics, they fuel the increasing polarization and hostility within our society. A society where the gloves are now off and no tactic is too extreme when vilifying the opposition. As a result, political discourse is becoming less about policy and more about outrage and division. Every issue, no matter how tragic or complex, is reduced to a battle between us and them, where nuance is abandoned in favor of emotional appeals and sensationalism. This isn't just rhetoric, it has real consequences. When tragedies occur, instead of uniting people in grief and collective action, they become weaponized to score political points, deepening societal fractures in an already volatile political climate. When I think of tragedy being politicized, the murder of 22-year-old nursing student Laken Riley is an emblematic example. For those who don't know, she was murdered by an undocumented immigrant while on a run, which sparked widespread media attention due to his undocumented status. Laken's murder was used by Trump during many of his rallies in 2024 as fodder to scapegoat and perpetuate harmful rhetoric toward minority groups.
When she was assaulted, horribly beaten, and horrifically killed by an illegal alien from Venezuela. The savage monster who murdered Laken was let in and released into our country by the open border policy of Kamala Harris. Immediately upon taking the oath of office, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history.
In the aftermath of her death, the U.S. government passed the Laken Riley Act in January 2025, a direct response to the public outrage. The legislation significantly expands the federal government's ability to detain and deport undocumented immigrants, even for minor infractions. While framed as a public safety measure, the act has been widely criticized for disproportionately targeting minority and immigrant communities.
If someone wants to point a finger and accuse someone of shoplifting, they will be rounded up
and put into a private detention camp and sent out for deportation without a day in court.
Not only that, but Lakin's own father has gone on record to denounce the politicization of his daughter's death.
Do you think a difference in immigration policy would have made a difference for Lakin?
We have no idea if that would have changed anything. I feel like she's being used somewhat politically.
How do you feel about that?
It makes me angry. She was much better than that. She should be raised up for the person that she is.
Trump had a surprising approach in informing and consoling the public in the wake of the tragedy of Flight 5342. His response was not focused on mourning the victims or addressing aviation safety concerns. Instead, he used it as an opportunity to attack DEI programs, falsely claiming that hiring policies for the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, prioritized people with disabilities over qualifications.
The FAA's diversity push includes focus on hiring people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. People with severe disabilities are most underrepresented segment of the workforce, and they want them in, and they can be air traffic controllers. I don't think so.
This wasn't just misleading, it was a calculated move to redirect blame onto marginalized groups, a tactic he has used incessantly to stoke division. This prompted a response from the American Association of People with Disabilities, whose president, Maria Town, said, quote, "The president is deliberately spreading falsehoods to demonize those living with disabilities rather than directing federal resources towards ensuring such a devastating tragedy never happens again." And she's right. But this kind of political maneuvering isn't exclusive to Trump or his party. Many of Trump's critics have blamed his FAA policy changes for recent crashes, claiming that his dysregulation efforts have created unsafe flying conditions. The rush to connect the crash directly to his administration reflects a broader trend in today's political climate. Speculation often replaces evidence, and blame is assigned before the facts are even known. One user tweeted, "Since Trump fired the head of the FAA, there have been 7 major plane crashes in the US. Make America great again." Another reads, "There's like 3 plane crashes a week since Trump took over the FAA military." However, experts argue that the effects of these policies take time to manifest. In response to these claims, Jim Cardoso, a former U.S. Air Force colonel and pilot, said the following for PolitiFact. "The actions by President Trump would not have led to such an immediate impact. All the processes to control and deconflict air traffic in the DC area have been well established for a long time." While John Cox, a retired pilot who runs a Florida-based aviation security consulting company, urges people to not speculate on causes so soon after the crash. He says, "At this point, we don't know enough. Anyone who argues that a specific factor caused the crash not even 24 hours after it happens is making an argument without foundation. The international standard for determining what caused a crash is not to speculate. You stay with the facts. The idea is that it's more important to get the right answer than a politically motivated answer." More people need to heed John Cox's advice here. The amount of people who are spewing their own biased theories on such a serious subject matter before official reports have even come out reflects the volatility of the current political climate. The back and forth blame game shows that both sides exploit tragedy to reinforce their agendas, often at the expense of meaningful discussion on actual solutions, and ultimately shifts focus away from what truly matters: the lives lost, the people left grieving, and the urgent need for real solutions to prevent future tragedies. So the most recent update in the situation was released March 11th, and it pretty much says that the NTSB released a preliminary report that detailed the facts of the situation, but does not contain any analysis or determination of probable cause into the accident. They continue to say that the NTSB's investigation will continue, and a board meeting will happen in the next coming months, followed by their final report. So as I'm recording this, it's been around 2 months since the accident has happened, and they have yet to confirm or propose any theories as to what has happened, and these meetings will still take another couple months. Now, we can certainly question Trump's changes in policy, defunding of programs and scapegoating of minority groups. In fact, I implore you to do so, but using innocent victims as political fodder is a shameless exploitation that perpetuates division and diminishes the voices and experiences of those directly affected. Neither side of the political spectrum should aim to make someone look bad at the expense of truth and fact, as that only results in undermining meaningful discourse. Take this comment I found on TikTok, for example. As long as it makes the Trump administration look bad, we don't care anymore. We used to, but not anymore, since the other side does it all the time and no one gives an F. There's certainly been an increase in the level of frustration, helplessness, and cynicism people feel toward Trump's politics. How does parroting harmful rhetoric get rewarded to the point of securing the highest position in the states twice? If he does, why can't I? While the sentiment is really valid, if the goal is real accountability, then mirroring Trump's tactics, no matter how justified it may feel, undermines that effort. When political debate becomes purely about optics, truth and accountability take a back seat. If one side engages in the same manipulative framing as the other, what's left to distinguish them? At that point, the conversation isn't about justice, it's about winning. I want to end this section with a quote from Maximilian Schenke in his article, The Tragic Politicization of Tragedy, for the Michigan Daily. Tragedy has a real human cost. In inappropriately politicizing tragedy, politicians obscure the cost of tragedy and diminish the efficacy of tragedy relief. To do this cost justice, politicians must thoroughly and vehemently approach tragedy's aftermath while avoiding political narratives.
Were you rushing or were you dragging?
I don't know.
So why isn't "we don't know" a good enough answer anymore? Why do we demand instant answers and rush to speculate when none exist? The death of nuance on the internet is a byproduct of an environment that thrives on immediacy and convenience. Nowadays, everything we could ever want is a couple clicks away, whether it's shopping, streaming, food, attention, even dating. And every time we partake in any of these things online, our brains listen and adapt, reinforcing these behaviors that prioritize speed over depth and reaction over reflection. This is the premise of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to reorganize and rewire itself based on our experiences, habits, and repeated behaviors. When a behavior is repeated, like ordering and eating fast food, the neural pathways for that behavior strengthen and become more efficient. It makes it easier for us to fall into these behaviors and creates habit, and in some more extreme cases, addiction. Not only this, but as we continue to act on cravings and short-term gratification, our brains release dopamine before any tangible reward is gained, a concept called dopamine-driven anticipation. This reinforces the craving itself rather than the satisfaction of the reward. To continue with the fast food example, what is your experience like when ordering food versus when it arrives at your house or after eating it? When I scroll through DoorDash, the idea of the food itself is oftentimes much more rewarding than the experience of eating it.
Yeah, that wasn't pleasant.
All right, I'll let them know.
That was hideous.
This could be due to the abhorrent amount of money spent, the food being cold when it comes, or the quality itself not matching my expectations. Hell, sometimes the food is fine, even good, but it doesn't hit the same as the craving. Despite having many cold food experiences or regretting ordering, I continue to do it. The reason for this is because our brain gets a strong hit of dopamine every time we make the decision to order. Of course, there is a dopamine release when eating, but science says that the release during anticipation is much larger, which creates a powerful cycle even if the food doesn't live up to expectation. Despite this, we continue ordering because the brain remembers the strong dopamine release. We have the same neurochemical responses when engaging with content on social media. A lot of the content we see nowadays is emotional, polarized, or sensationalized, and when we continue engaging with it, our brains adapt to and expect that kind of instant stimulation and emotional intensity. Bella Borgamini articulates this feeling very well in her article Emotional Whiplash on Social Media is Overwhelming, where she describes a very common experience nowadays of scrolling on social media and seeing one post that's emotional and inspirational and bringing you to tears, and the next you see graphic coverage of the bombings in Gaza or the latest celebrity passing or a brutal case of SA. There's a reason why people say that younger generations who have grown up with the internet are far more desensitized to world events and violence. Over time, this reinforces a preference for quick, high-impact information, making nuanced discussions and complex ideas feel tedious or unsatisfying by comparison. I'm sure many of you have seen those comments on videos, usually by younger people, that say something along the lines of, "I'm not reading all that," in response to a long comment or a video with a lot of text, which epitomizes this idea. The shift doesn't just change how we consume content, it shapes how we think, process information, and even engage in conversations. Our brains aren't just adapting to this, they're being trained by it. Social media isn't just responding to our craving for speed and stimulation, it's engineering it. Platforms like Twitter, now X, TikTok, and Instagram Reels are built around short, punchy content where the goal isn't depth, it's retention. Twitter's character limit forces people to distill complex ideas into bite-sized takes, stripping out content and nuance. Even long-form YouTube videos follow the same pattern. The best practice is to hook viewers immediately and get to the point as fast as possible.
This is my very own planet, and one of these 5,000 people will walk away with it. But they have to go through a series of dangerous courses like this.
In this environment, complexity isn't just discouraged, it's a liability to the content itself. This focus on brevity and constant bombardment of information is also not conducive to long-form memory consolidation, so creators and public figures often find ways to quickly and intensely grab your attention.
Dr. Matt Johnson's article, The Psychology Behind TikTok's Memory Interference, goes more in depth into this, but essentially we need downtime to allow our experiences to convert or consolidate into memory. So when we're using TikTok, we're essentially allowing ourselves to exist in a perpetual state of interference where the information we're seeing on TikTok is not given enough time to reach our memory before we're scrolling and looking at another video.
With endless content competing for our attention, the most emotionally provocative content usually rises to the top. Clickbait titles and exaggerated claims like shocking, worst, or you won't believe this set clear expectations before a viewer ever engages. And once someone clicks, algorithms reinforce these preferences, ensuring that the most simplified, emotionally charged narratives are the ones that get pushed. This is a strategy used by many modern politicians who have short, emotionally charged slogans and phrases to catch our attention. Illegal aliens, fake news, make America great again. These slogans and sayings work because they strip complexity down into an easy-to-digest emotional appeal, which is needed in this online and political landscape where attention is constantly fluctuating. Now, social media doesn't always reward thoughtful discussion, but it does reward instant emotional reactions. There's a reason why people don't care about hate comments on posts, because negative comments still help the creator through engagement. The angrier or more outraged people feel, the likelier they are to engage and share. Political leaders like Trump, who reduce complex issues to clear villains and heroes, thrive in this ecosystem because nuance is too slow, too uncertain, and too inconvenient for the algorithm. The result? A digital landscape where everything is a take, nothing is a conversation, and the loudest, most extreme voices dominate. If social media is where we form our worldviews, then we're training ourselves to see the world in black and white, good and evil, right and wrong, when reality is almost always gray. We're living in a day and age where it's imperative to be mindful of how we engage with content from social and traditional media. As I said before, it really does feel like the gloves are now off, with corporate greed running amok, where the elites value lining their pockets more than human lives. And it's been really scary to see how quick people are to divide and ostracize others. This isn't the time for that. It only serves to make the rich richer, and they don't care. They've made it a point to not care. And I think it's really telling through tragedies like this, where people's values and priorities lie. If someone, and you know who I'm talking about, sees a vulnerable moment where people are at their lowest, are scared and grieving, and use it as leverage for not only personal gain, but as ammunition for harmful rhetoric, the alarm bells should be ringing. And to be transparent, it's really discouraging to see that they aren't for some people. So while the primary focus of this video might have been on why we feel like plane crashes are happening more, the bigger takeaway is how the same psychological factors influencing our perception of risks can be applied to help us navigate the current political climate. Recognizing these patterns is key to making more informed decisions and protecting ourselves from being manipulated by forces that thrive on division and fear, to be more critical with our media consumption.